Welcome to True Echo, where powerful real-life inspired stories reveal the hidden beauty in human resilience, memory, and redemption. In today's story, a quiet man sits at a hotel piano, unnoticed and out of place, until a melody stuns a luxury lobby into silence. But the real shock comes when the world's most reclusive composer appears behind him, in tears. What follows is a breathtaking journey across cities, decades, and a single unfinished song, one that holds a secret capable of rewriting history, family, and fame. Underscore 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 underscore. Story title: SEO optimized. He played piano in a hotel lobby, but no one expected a world-famous composer behind him. Underscore 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 underscore. Video description, with emojis. Musical keyboard: a worn coat. A forgotten piano. A melody the world hadn't heard in 12 years. Elliot Marsh never wanted the spotlight. But when he sat at a dusty Steinway in a luxury hotel lobby, his quiet tribute to a sister long lost caught the attention of the world's most mysterious composer, Daniel Atwood, who hadn't been seen since his final work was left unfinished, until now. What happened next stunned the music world, revealed a family secret buried in grief, and sparked a global movement that reminded us all: the most powerful legacies are born not of fame, but of truth. Watch until the end. One note changed everything. Keywords: high volume. Piano prodigy, inspirational music story, Daniel Atwood. Elliot Marsh, emotional piano performance, hotel pianist. Viral, true story. Inspiration, grief and music, hidden talent discovery, famous composer, emotional reunion, unfinished composition, viral piano moment, music legacy, anonymous pianist. Viral. Hashtags. Hashtag True Echo, hashtag piano story, hashtag emotional performance, hashtag real life inspiration, hashtag hidden talent, hashtag music heals, hashtag Daniel Atwood, hashtag Elliot Marsh, hashtag hotel pianist, hashtag viral moment, hashtag Amara's song. Underscore 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 underscore. I'll begin writing part 1 of the story immediately below. Part 1. The marble floors of the Atoria Grande reflected more than just light. They held memories of footsteps, of arrivals and departures, of whispered secrets carried on perfume and power. But none of that mattered to Elliot Marsh as he stepped into the lobby that winter afternoon, dressed in a coat older than the building's most recent renovation. He looked out of place. His shoes were worn, soles thinned by years of walking, and the satchel slung over his shoulders sagged like it had given up on standing tall. No one paid him any mind at first, just another tired traveler in a sea of business suits and winter scarves. But the moment he paused in front of the grand piano, something shifted. It wasn't visible. It wasn't even obvious. But it was there, a silence, like the air itself inhaled. "Sir, that piano is reserved for hotel performers only," came the voice of the concierge, slicing through the hum of quiet wealth with practiced indifference. Elliot didn't respond. He simply nodded once, not apologetic, not defiant, just quiet, and sat. The lid opened with a soft creak, and he touched the keys like greeting an old friend. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then he played a single note, a hollow, sustained. Then another. A minor key melody began to unfurl, unadorned and slow, each note planted like a memory. At first, no one noticed. A businessman kept scrolling through his tablet. A child threw a tantrum near the front desk. A couple argued softly by the fountain. But then the sound found its way into the spaces people didn't guard, the space behind a sigh, between thoughts. And like a ripple on still water, heads began to turn. The pianist didn't look up. He wasn't playing for them. He was somewhere else entirely. Isabel Hart noticed it first, not the melody, but the ache. She was halfway through a cappuccino in the corner lounge when the sound wrapped itself around her ribs like a familiar grief. Her cup hovered, untouched. Her eyes widened. The melody, it wasn't just beautiful. It was familiar. Unfinished. Impossible. Her heart froze. Because Isabel had heard that song before. Or at least part of it. A decade ago. A melody only one man in the world had ever written, Daniel Atwood, the mythic composer who vanished after the death of his muse, Amara. This was impossible. Her breath caught. She stood, slowly, approaching the piano. Elliot's hands moved not with the precision of performance, but with the weight of memory. There was no flair, no flourish, only feeling. By now, conversations had stopped. Phones were lowered. Even the concierge, now flanked by a hotel supervisor, was still. Something was happening. Something sacred. Isabel whispered to no one, "Where did he come from?" No one could answer. Behind the piano, unnoticed at first, a man in a dark overcoat had entered. He removed his gloves slowly. He sat. And then he began to cry. Daniel Atwood, the Daniel Atwood, sat behind the stranger in the coat. And wept. The air in the room folded inward, like gravity had changed. But Elliot kept playing. He didn't need to turn. He already knew. He had carried this melody for 12 years, across states, through seasons, from alleyway corners to empty churches, never knowing why it refused to leave him. But he played it every year, same day, same time. For her. His sister. He didn't know it belonged to the man now seated behind him, not entirely. But he felt it. When the last note fell like a feather into stillness, Elliot finally turned. Their eyes met. Two men. Two shadows. Two stories that had run parallel for far too long, now colliding. Daniel spoke first. "You knew her." Elliot nodded. "She was my sister." And just like that, the truth spilled open like the final chord of a requiem, delicate, final, and forever changing everything that came before. Gasps traveled through the marble-clad lobby like a current. A few guests stood in stunned silence, hands over mouths. Others instinctively raised phones, unsure whether to record or simply hold them, frozen by the raw weight of what they were witnessing. But most did nothing. They just stood there, holding their breath. Because grief had no volume, but it filled the room. Daniel Atwood stood slowly. His eyes remained on Elliot, but something inside them had shifted, not recognition, but surrender. A composer, once heralded as the voice of modern musical genius, now faced a man in a threadbare coat who had just breathed life into a melody the world thought had died with Amara. "You played it exactly as she described," Daniel whispered. The restraint. The ache. Even the pause before the fifth refrain. Elliot's voice was soft, hollow. She used to hum it when she cooked. When she cried. Said you never finished it. Daniel nodded slowly. Because I couldn't. After she died. I tried, but the notes felt like knives. A beat passed between them. The crowd listened not to the words, but the space between them, as though the music was still unfolding. I didn't finish it either, Elliot murmured. I just kept it alive. Daniel's breath shuddered. And that's why you deserve to finish it now. Before Elliot could respond, Isabel stepped forward. Her presence, until now secondary, suddenly centered itself with quiet authority. Her black dress moved like smoke, her eyes fierce yet mournful. "This piece," she said firmly, addressing the gathering crowd, "was never just music. It was a memory. A living, unfinished truth that's finally come home." Someone in the back whispered, "Who is he?" Daniel turned to them, voice sharper now. "He's the one who remembered her. When I couldn't." Elliot lowered his gaze. "I wasn't trying to remember her for anyone else. I just didn't want to forget." Isabel's voice softened. "Then you did exactly what she asked." The room stilled again. Daniel stepped forward, pulling something from the inside of his coat, a folded program from 12 years ago, yellowed at the edges. He handed it to Elliot. "The night of her final recital," he said. "She wrote something on the back. I never understood it until now." Elliot unfolded it carefully. Scribbled in looping script were just 6 words. "He'll play it when it's time." His knees nearly buckled. "She meant you," Daniel said. Emotion twisted Elliot's face into something between a smile and a sob. "I don't deserve this. I'm not trained. I'm not a professional." Daniel shook his head. "That's exactly why it matters." In that moment, Isabel stepped between them. "Vienna," she said simply. Elliot blinked. "What?" "We start in Vienna," Daniel repeated. "That's where she studied. That's where the world hears her story, and yours, together." A slow, stunned silence passed between them before Elliot finally nodded. "Okay, but on one condition." Daniel raised a brow. "We do it in her name." A pause. "Always," Daniel said. From that point on, the lobby of the Atoria Grand wasn't just a hotel entrance. It became legend. No plaque. No announcement. But anyone who stepped into that space afterward could feel it, a hush in the walls, a pause in the air, like something sacred had once happened and hadn't quite left. Back in his modest apartment that evening, Elliot sat on the edge of his twin mattress, staring down at the tattered satchel where he'd kept Amara's photograph since the day she died. He opened it carefully. The picture, sun-faded and wrinkled, showed a young Amara with her arm around a 16-year-old boy with shaggy curls and 2 big glasses. He'd never played for fame. Never played for crowds. But that night, for the first time since her funeral, Elliot Marsh cried, not because he was broken. But because maybe, he was finally ready to be whole again. The letter arrived 3 days later, not by courier, not in a sleek manila envelope, but in a hand-delivered white folder left at the front desk of Elliot's apartment building. No sender listed. Just his name in neat, assertive print. Inside was a single sheet of heavy linen paper. Vienna Musikverein. World premiere. Final composition, Amara's Song. Featuring, Elliot Marsh and Daniel Atwood. A note was clipped to the top, "You don't audition for truth. You live it. Flights arranged. We'll rehearse in silence. D.A." Elliot read it once, then again. His first instinct was to fold the paper and tuck it somewhere safe, like a treasure. His second was to run. He didn't belong on that kind of stage. Not in Vienna. Not alongside Daniel Atwood. He didn't even own proper dress shoes. But the third instinct, the quietest, was the one he obeyed. She would have wanted this. The flight to Austria felt like a hallucination. Elliot watched clouds pass like slow-moving ghosts, headphones tucked into his ears but no music playing. Just the hum of the plane, the ticking of time he could no longer stall. At the hotel in Vienna, Daniel greeted him not with a handshake, but with a small, worn leather-bound notebook. Every unfinished phrase, Daniel said, every attempt. "I never had the courage to tear it out. Now it's yours." Elliot ran his fingers over the cover as if it were Amara's shoulder. Then he opened it. The pages were chaos, Bars of music scribbled over and over again, time signatures rewritten, harmonies scratched out. But within that storm of genius and grief, he found her, tucked between notes, in the loops of letters, in a small annotation dated 6 weeks before her death. Let Elliot end it. He knows where it's going. Tears stung his eyes. I don't even know if I can, he admitted aloud. Daniel sat down across from him. You already did. In the lobby. You just have to remember it. They rehearsed that night in the empty concert hall. No orchestra. No audience. Just Elliot, Daniel, and the piano. The first few minutes were hesitant, Elliot's fingers trembled against the keys, his rhythm uncertain. You're trying to get it right, Daniel said quietly. Don't. Get it honest. Elliot exhaled and began again. This time, the music flowed. It wasn't clean. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. When they reached the movement Daniel had never been able to finish, Elliot filled the space not with flourish, but with memory, the way Amara used to hum over boiling tea, the half-step she'd hum under her breath when she thought no one was listening. Daniel's hands trembled on his own keys. At the final chord, both men sat in silence. She's here, Daniel whispered. She's in that note. Elliot said nothing. He just let the silence hold. The night of the premiere arrived like a tide. Elliot stood backstage in a tailored charcoal suit, modest, clean, not showy, with his old satchel tucked just behind the curtain. He had insisted it be close. The Musikverein pulsed with expectation. Critics filled the velvet chairs. Streamed cameras buzzed quietly above the mezzanine. Musical dignitaries in tailored coats filled the hall with whispers. But Elliot? He felt none of it. He carried a letter in his pocket, Amara's. He hadn't reread it since that night in Paris, but just knowing it was there settled something inside him. Isabel stood beside him now, clipboard in hand. You ready? He shook his head. No. But I'm going anyway. She smiled. Then you're exactly where you're supposed to be. The lights dimmed. The announcer's voice rose above the stillness. Tonight's world premiere, Amara's Song, features Daniel Atwood and Elliot Marsh. This is not merely a performance. It is a story. A homecoming. Elliot stepped onto the stage. The applause was polite. Confused, even. Who was this man? But then he sat. And played. The same melody that had once drifted through a quiet hotel lobby now bloomed into the rafters of the great Vienna Hall. It wasn't louder, just braver. When Daniel joined, the piece shifted, 2 voices in unison. And in the final movement, Elliot took a pause, longer than written, long enough to feel her. And then he played her final measure. It was fragile, raw, and almost broken. And it was perfect. As the last note dissolved, silence reigned. Then, a slow, standing ovation. No shouting. Just reverent applause, like the crowd didn't know whether to clap or cry. Daniel stood, bowed once, then turned to Elliot and whispered, she would have laughed at all this fuss. Elliot smiled faintly. She never wanted to be famous. No, Daniel said. Just heard. And that night, she was. The next morning brought a strange, quiet kind of dawn. Elliot sat at the small hotel desk, the pale light of Vienna's morning snow filtering through lace curtains. The world had shifted overnight, but his hand still bore the warmth of the final note, as if the piano's keys hadn't quite let him go. He wasn't thinking about the ovation. He wasn't thinking about the reporters or the invitations already waiting at the front desk. He was thinking about her. He opened Amara's letter again, not to read, but to feel. The crease down the center was soft now from so many folds. Her handwriting had become a companion. The curve of her A's, the way she dotted her I's like she was still humming when she wrote them. But just as he was folding it closed again, his phone buzzed. A message, No name, no subject. Just 8 words. You don't know the whole story yet. Elliot's breath caught. He stared. Blinked. Checked the sender. Just initials, ML. Then another message arrived. If you're ready, come to Asheville. He read it again. Asheville. It was a name buried somewhere deep, not in memory, but in feeling. Something about it tugged at his chest like a distant chord. The message ended with a location and one line. She left something behind. Something even Daniel doesn't know. For a full hour, Elliot just sat. Then, wordlessly, he booked the flight. The road into Asheville twisted through the Blue Ridge Mountains like a ribbon laid by memory. It was quiet country, untouched by the noise of cities, too slow for the modern world to notice, which made it perfect for secrets. At the top of a narrow hill stood a small wooden cottage. White paint peeling. One rocking chair on the porch. A wind chime hung by the door, silent in the stillness. A woman opened the door before he could knock. She looked to be in her 60s, hair silver at the edges, her flannel sleeves rolled up like she'd just been shelling peas or washing a hymn from the past. Her eyes met Elliot's like she'd seen him before, not last week, but lifetimes ago. "You're Elliot," she said. Not a question. He nodded. "You're ML." She smiled faintly. "Mira Langston." She called me Mara. They shook hands. Her grip was warm, firm, the kind of woman who'd never owned a piano but would sit and listen to one all night if it meant something. "Come in," she said. "I've been keeping something safe." The inside of the cottage smelled like cedar, lemon tea, and old books. Everything was soft, from the pillows to the way sunlight filtered through dusty windows. There was a photo on the mantel, Amara, young and laughing, her arm around a teenage Mira. "We met in Carolina. Played together in a church basement before Vienna," Mira said, noticing his gaze. "She never told me about you," Elliot whispered. "She didn't tell many people about this place," Mira replied. "It was where she came when she needed to be, only herself." She crossed the room and opened a cabinet. From within, she drew a slim, linen-covered folder. She placed it on the coffee table between them like a sacred relic. "She made me promise not to open it," Mira said. "Said one day someone would come who had earned it. That I'd know when." Elliot's hands shook slightly as he reached for it. He opened it gently. Inside were 4 sheets of handwritten music, but not just music. There were notes, yes, but also prose. Letters between the bars. A composition woven with farewell. He read the first line aloud, barely breathing. "To the soul I never thought I'd have to leave behind." His chest collapsed. Mira watched him quietly. No pity. Just presence. "She wrote it just for me," he whispered, his voice cracking. Mira nodded. "And she knew you'd understand what to do with it." Elliot traced the lines with trembling fingers. The tempo markings were strange, dolce ma pesant, sweet but heavy. One phrase was circled twice, with a note in her voice, "Pause here. Let it ache." Tears came, slow and steady, soaking into the corner of the final page. This wasn't meant for stages. It wasn't meant for orchestras or critics. It was a lullaby. A goodbye. A gift. That afternoon, Mira took him to a chapel. Small, whitewashed, beams exposed, rows of simple folding chairs, a battered upright piano resting like an old friend at the front. "This is where she wrote it," Mira said softly. "This is where she played for no one but the echoes." Elliot stepped forward, the folder still pressed to his chest like armor. He sat. No crowd. No cameras. Just him and her. And then, he played. The first note was uncertain, like a question asked in the dark. Then another. Then a phrase. The melody was not sorrowful. It was intimate. Gentle. Like holding someone's hand as they drift into sleep, knowing they won't wake. A measure of silence. Then a minor key. A breathless high E that sounded like her voice when she was 16, telling him, keep playing, Elliot. Even when I'm gone. And then, the end. Not a resolution. Not a triumph. Just peace. He lifted his hands. The silence afterward felt sacred. Then a rustle behind him. He turned. At the chapel door stood a woman holding a small child, and behind her, more people, elderly, young, strangers in simple clothes, stepping inside quietly, reverently. Word had spread. Someone asked softly, was that her last song? Elliot nodded. And someone whispered, will he play again? Elliot didn't answer. He just sat down, and began once more. Not for legacy. Not for fame. But because the story wasn't finished. Not yet. The days that followed were not measured in hours but in melodies. Each morning, Elliot returned to the small white chapel with the battered upright piano. At first, he played alone. Then for Mira. Then for a handful of strangers who came not for spectacle, but for something else, something quieter. A mother brought her nonverbal son. He sat cross-legged on the wood floor, hands pressed to the vibrating boards beneath him as Elliot played Amara's lullaby again. When the final note faded, the boy tapped out the rhythm on his leg for minutes afterward, smiling softly, as if echoing it back. Word spread beyond Asheville. They called it, the Chapel of the Lost Note. Reporters tried to cover it. They left confused. There were no schedules. No program. No price of admission. No sound crew. Just Elliot, a piano, and a folder of Amara's music. And each time he played it, truly played it, something in the room seemed to soften. A girl who hadn't spoken since her father died whispered afterward, it felt like my mom was hugging me again. A grizzled veteran pressed his palm to the wood and muttered, that's the sound I heard when I came home from war. People cried. They left flowers. Some just stood outside and listened through the windows. But Elliot, he was changing, too. Not in the way fame changes a man, but in the way truth does. He stood straighter. Spoke slower. His once timid hands became confident storytellers across the ivory keys. Mira watched him one morning as he closed the lid gently over the piano. She left this to heal you, she said. But you're healing others now. He smiled faintly. I think I'm just finally listening. Then, one rainy afternoon, Daniel arrived. He stepped through the chapel doors in a black overcoat, soaked from the storm. But his eyes were dry, alert. He didn't interrupt. He just stood at the back and listened to the final verse of the lullaby. When Elliot finished, Daniel walked forward slowly. I didn't know she had written more, he said quietly. She left it with Mira, Elliot replied. Said it wasn't for the world. Just for truth. Daniel stood beside him at the piano. His eyes swept the crowd, then the flowers laid at the side of the altar. They asked me to bring you something, he said, pulling a thick envelope from his coat. Elliot opened it slowly. Inside were 5 international invitations, Tokyo, Prague, Cape Town, Rio, and New York, each asking for an evening with Elliot Marsh, the final song of Amara. Elliot froze. You don't have to do them, Daniel said gently. But the world's listening now. I didn't play it for the world. Daniel nodded. But the world needs it. And if she trusted you with it, then maybe we're all just catching up. Elliot looked around the chapel, at Mira, at the elderly man still weeping in the second row, at the couple holding hands as if the music had fixed something broken between them. I'll go, Elliot finally said. But not alone. And not on a stage built for clapping. Daniel tilted his head. Then how? Elliot stood. Like this. One city at a time. One room. One piano. No fanfare. Daniel smiled. You're more artist than you know. Elliot met his gaze. No. I'm just someone who listened too late, and doesn't want anyone else to. The tour wasn't glamorous. In Tokyo, he played in a hospital wing. In Cape Town, inside an abandoned church. In Prague, under stained glass shattered during the war. Each time, he started with Amara's song, always with her picture nearby, and ended with silence. But in New York, something happened. The venue had been arranged by Daniel, a former opera house repurposed as a community art space. On the morning of the event, Elliot stood by the stage door when a girl no older than 10 approached him. She wore a scarf over her hair and held a sheet of crumpled paper. My mom used to sing this to me, she said. But I never heard the rest of the song until you played it online. Elliot knelt. What's your name? Selah. He read the paper. The first 6 notes of Amara's lullaby, shakily drawn. She used to say it meant I could sleep safe, Selah whispered. Elliot's chest tightened. She was right. He brought her on stage that night. No lights. No speeches. Just him, Selah, and the piano. They played together, her hands trembling, his steady. The crowd cried again. But this time, Elliot didn't. Because he understood something now. Amara hadn't written the song to be performed. She wrote it to be shared. And in that moment, with a little girl beside him and the world holding its breath, Elliot Marsh didn't feel like the boy she left behind. He felt like the man she knew he'd become. Winter had settled deep into New York by the time Elliot's final show came around. Snowflakes clung to fire escapes like whispered promises, and the streets buzzed with hurried feet and hushed anticipation. But inside the venue, the world seemed to exhale. Warm light poured onto a modest stage, centered around one thing, a single, polished grand piano with a worn folder resting on top. There were no banners. No spotlights. Just a simple plaque at the entry. An evening of unfinished notes. Elliot sat backstage, alone, the low hum of the audience barely seeping through the thick curtains. His fingers moved through the air, practicing muscle memory without sound, the lullaby, the rise and fall, the ache of the pause before the 5th refrain. The world knew it now. But to him, it would always be hers. Daniel entered quietly and stood beside him. They're ready. Elliot nodded, eyes closed. I'm not sure I am. Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. This isn't the end. You know that, right? I know, Elliot said, smiling faintly. But it feels like saying goodbye all over again. Daniel looked out at the curtains, where 1,000 people waited in reverent silence. Then say it how she would have wanted, not as a goodbye, but as a beginning. The lights dimmed. Elliot stepped into the glow with the same quiet presence he'd carried since that first morning in the hotel lobby. The applause was respectful, but subdued. No cheering. No flash photography. Just presence, the kind that aches with gratitude. He sat. He didn't speak. He simply placed Amara's photograph atop the piano, opened the folder, and began. And the moment he did, time stilled. The first notes drifted like snowflakes. The melody wound gently, a ribbon through 1,000 silent hearts. Every note had been memorized by now, yet still, it felt new. As if it had never been played the same way twice. He reached the final page. The final line. The final refrain. And then. He stopped. Just before the last note. Silence. A long, suspended breath hung in the air, stretching longer than anyone expected. At first, the crowd waited, thinking it was part of the music. Then they leaned forward. Then they understood. He wasn't playing the last note. He was offering it. And then. From the second row, a child, Selah, stood. With trembling fingers, she stepped forward to the edge of the stage. The audience parted around her like sacred water. She reached the piano. Elliot stood and stepped aside, giving her the bench. Her small hands rose slowly. And she played it. That final note. Sweet. Barely audible. But true. The sound lingered in the stillness like a soul finding its way home. And the room erupted, not into applause, but tears. Some sobbed openly. Others sat, stunned, hands over hearts. It was as if Amara herself had walked across the keys and kissed them all goodbye. Elliot stood beside Selah and placed his hand gently on her shoulder. She finished it, he whispered. But Selah looked up at him, eyes wide, and said something that chilled him to the bone. No. She left more. Later that night, back at his hotel, Elliot sat on the floor, surrounded by flowers, cards, and messages. Thousands had poured in. Some from strangers. Others from renowned musicians. Even symphonies. All asking to license the lullaby. Turn it into something bigger. He ignored them all. His eyes were locked on the envelope Selah had slipped into his hand before leaving. Inside was a second, much older folder, one he didn't recognize. On the front, in Amara's handwriting, were the words. Volume 2, when he's ready. His breath caught. Slowly, reverently, he opened it. Inside were not just melodies, but stories. Letters. Sheet music with cryptic tempo markings, sketches of unfamiliar keys, notations in languages he didn't speak. But one line, scrawled on the very last page, hit him like a thunderclap. This music is for the world we never got to build. His hands trembled. He realized then, Amara had never meant for her song to end. She had always seen it as a beginning, a movement. A ripple. A revolution of emotion and truth and healing that didn't belong to stages or applause. It belonged to everyone. Elliot stood and walked to the piano in his suite. Snow danced outside the window. He placed the second volume on the music rack. The paper looked ancient. Some notes had water stains, maybe from tears. Others were smudged, like she'd changed her mind mid-phrase. But all of it felt alive. He took a deep breath. And began to play. The sound that followed wasn't perfect. But it was real. And in that room, on that snowy night, a new melody was born, not just from the keys, but from memory, from loss, and from love left unfinished. He whispered into the music. We're not done, Amara. Not yet. 6 months later, they gathered in a circle, not in Vienna, or New York, or some marble concert hall adorned with velvet curtains. But in a community center in Detroit. Fold-up chairs. A mismatched rug beneath the piano. And at the center, Elliot, Selah, and a dozen other children from different cities, schools, and stories, all holding instruments far too big for their hands. This was the real tour now. Not through cities, but through people. Daniel stood at the back, watching as Elliot nodded to Selah, who counted off with her fingers. 1. 2. 3. The music they played wasn't from Amara's first song. It was from the second volume, the unfinished one. And now, it was theirs. But the notes had changed. They were looser now. Not a rigid composition, but an open invitation. A foundation, not a ceiling. Because Elliot had realized something vital. He was never meant to finish Amara's music. He was meant to start it, and then let it grow. After Detroit came Atlanta. Then Chicago. Then Cape Town, again. But this time, no reporters came. No articles were written. And Elliot didn't mind. The music wasn't for headlines anymore. It was for healing. He partnered with schools, trauma clinics, youth shelters, anywhere that silence had become too loud. He didn't just play. He taught. Not reading sheet music, but feeling it. Hearing stories in keys. Letting pain become art. One boy, 14, who'd lost both parents, composed a solo from just 5 notes. Elliot cried when he played it. A girl who hadn't spoken since witnessing a violent act improvised an entire bridge on the violin, whispering afterward, it sounded like breathing. And each time, Elliot added their names to the end of the score, not as performers, but as co-authors. The world didn't need another genius. It needed a choir of broken, rising voices. Years later, long after Elliot's hair had gone silver and the lines in his face deepened with peace rather than worry, he sat in his favorite place in the world. The little white chapel in Asheville. He pressed record on an old camera, looked straight into the lens, and began. If you're watching this, you may have found one of our copies. We've left them everywhere, parks, shelters, schools, churches, street corners. Inside, you'll find not just a song. You'll find a space. A pause in the noise. Amara believed music could be a letter to those we might never meet. So if you're hurting, play it. If you're healing, add to it. This song isn't finished. And maybe it never will be. He closed the folder, now faded and worn, and placed it on the bench beside him. Then he reached into his satchel and pulled out one last envelope, still sealed. He hadn't opened it all these years. Amara's final letter. With trembling hands, he broke the wax seal and unfolded the page. Elliot. If you've made it here, then I already know you didn't just survive. You grew. You always saw music as something sacred. And you were right. But you forgot that you, too, are sacred. That your story is not too quiet to be sung. I left you the song, not because you were the best pianist, but because you were the only one who could carry both the sorrow and the joy. You were my beginning. But more importantly, you're someone else's beginning now. Don't mourn me forever. Dance with me through the lives you touch. I'll be listening. His tears fell freely now. Not the tears of a man lost in grief, but of a soul who had finally come home. That summer, a little boy in Brazil found a weathered folder left on a park bench. Inside, a simple sheet of music titled, Amara's Song. He had never played piano before. But that night, in a quiet room lit only by a desk lamp, he tried. The notes weren't perfect. But they were true. And somewhere, far beyond sound, Amara smiled.